Joelle Tanguy, Director of Strategic Partnership Division in UN Women. Welcome to Al Arabiya.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
Thank you. I would like to start with UN Women. What are the objectives, the real objectives of UN Women?
So UN Women is actually a UN agency established very recently to advance the empowerment of women and gender equality. But if you want to kind of say it in more simple terms, we're there to make sure that the girls of today have the future that they desire without discrimination, without violence. And that's the role of UN Women. We support women and girls economically, politically. We support an end to violence against women. And we also pay particular attention to both the trouble and the opportunities of engaging women in humanitarian crisis, in disasters, and in peace and security issues.
The He for She campaign, which was launched in March of 2014, promoting involvement of men to take a stand for women. How is it doing? Is it successful?
It's a very important campaign to us because it aims to make sure that the advancement of women is not just a women's agenda. It's actually the agenda of men and boys. Why would we go this way? Is because actually men and boys are as much as women and girls shaping our societies, shaping our future. You, your sons, our daughters are all participating into defining the gender roles. And so it's as important to involve men and boys. But for us, we also see this as an opportunity to actually engage also youth. This was launched with Emma Watson, and which really was an opportunity for us to really kind of bring the conversation that's sometimes a bit theoretical into very practical terms. What does gender equality means on campus? How do we protect girls from violence? And really creating a digital and a really large movement. And we have seen this movement take off in many countries, and it has an organic growth on its own.
I would like to discuss with you now some of the worst problems facing women and girls around the world, such as violence and abuse. 1 in 3 women have experienced violence at one stage or another around the world. 1/3 of the population of women have suffered from violence. What are you doing to stem the violence?
Isn't it a stunning statistic? 1 in 3 women experiences violence, including sexual violence, in the course of their lifetime. And what we're trying to do in particular is first to give it visibility. And it's getting a whole lot more visibility nowadays. But more importantly, we're trying to do very practical things to protect women. We're working with governments to change laws, to enhance the protection by the law. We're working with authorities and police in order to make sure that victims and survivors of violence are well supported. And we are ourselves empowering groups to actually provide better services to survivors of violence. It's an epidemic at the moment. It was called an epidemic by WHO, but what we're hoping is that the visibility that societies are now having on this issue is going to drive change, and really we'll find ourselves before 2030 with a much different reality.
Another problem that is really spreading as well, especially in developing countries, child marriage. For example, in a country in the Middle East, without naming name, they are drafting a law, they're considering a law to allow the marriage at the age of 9 to the girl. Some families in poor countries, I don't want to mention names again, are marrying their daughters because of economic hardship. What are you doing about it?
So first, I think we have to really make sure that it's understood that we're not making a social judgment, we're making actually an evidence-based recommendation, not a recommendation, a demand, that we actually end child marriage. Why? It's creating a path for poverty for girls. Girls who do not get education eventually end up being at the bottom of the economic prospects. It's creating massive health issues. In fact, being a young woman married early on is one of the major factors of HIV/AIDS mortality. It's really affecting many aspects of the economy. It's preventing societies from actually teaching their girls, educating them, giving them the power to become proactive in the economy, it's actually hurting us all, and particularly giving a dire future for girls. So we're actually working very diligently with many member states. We've seen tremendous progress. I think 7 laws were changed that in the last 2 years. 7 countries established laws that prevented child marriage in the last 2 years.
Trafficking in women and girls, it's still rife today. It's still widespread. Why has it proven so hard to defeat and change?
It's an incredible development, because when we should be seeing it reduced, it's actually been exponentially growing.
Yes.
Particularly with the destabilization in Syria, in Iraq, and a number of Middle Eastern countries. But what we're seeing is actually this trafficking is not just a regional problem, it's a global problem. It's a problem that it has become economically the most profitable source of income for illicit trade. It's
better than arms and drugs. Huh?
Exactly. If you want to have a quick path, you are into slavery and sexual abuse of women. 20 million women are slaves. 5 million of them are sexual slaves around the world. This is a tremendous problem.
How can we beat this?
I think that there is a real mobilization around the world. I think what there is probably limits to what governments can do, because this is illicit trade, but there is a real awakening of that reality, and I think that what we have now is probably too slow we have seen too slow a response since the beginning of the crisis in Syria, but we have the sense that there is a real mobilization among governments to actually fund efforts in that area, to particularly not place. We have to realize that actually trafficking is also fueled by the poverty experienced by the communities that are being raided by those traffickers. If women are empowered in their communities, if they can actually keep their girls in school, if they can feed them, then they actually are less likely to be the victims of violence and trafficking.
Your visit to Saudi Arabia, you visited them in March of this year, and you gave a lecture over there, and you spoke to many Saudi women. How do you see the role of Saudi women changing?
Oh, I thought that was actually a very interesting encounter. I had the chance to speak to hundreds of women, and many of them actually very young women. Many women who had actually also done amazing things, like being top scientists among the world, in the world. Women who had created very successful technology projects. It kind of was an eye-opening moment. I also met women who deal with the most impoverished women and girls in the country, who are providing support, social support to them. And the reality for me was far more complex than people understand. But what was very interesting is the aspiration, the passion, the hope that was in that youth. Young women in Saudi Arabia have amazing aspirations for the future. They are really hoping that the future will deliver the promises.
Women in Saudi Arabia have recently obtained the right to drive, and they will start driving from June of next year, 2018. What, in your opinion, would be the impact, the real impact of having women driving themselves?
The first one is a symbolic impact. This was, in the women that I met, the #1 demand. It was very symbolic of their equal opportunity. Why can't we drive? Oh, I met women who were telling me, I direct 100 men in my business, but in the morning I have to call Uber to go to work. And that was kind of an example of the strangeness of that law. So we're really seeing this as a symbol of progress. But more importantly, I think we have to realize that this is actually going to provide millions of women the ability to actually start their own business independently, actually go to work, participate in the world of work, and therefore enhance the economic prospect of the country as well. So it's not an insignificant move. It's not only a symbolic move. It's both essential. It was an essential demand of women in the country, and we're very pleased to see it met. And we are looking very much forward to also see it impact positively the economy of the country.
I want to ask you now, how do you see the whole Saudi vision to 2030 in improving the equality of opportunity of life for all in Saudi Arabia?
For all. Interestingly, the text mentions women and men, and therefore it actually introduces the idea that both women and men must be economically empowered. It's not surprising. I mean, Saudi Arabia, unknown to many people, has now more university graduate women than university graduate men. So inevitably, it has the potential, if it taps on that expertise, that leadership, that knowledge, to actually make major advances economically. And that's why the economic and social vision includes the participation of women. We look very much forward to see this happen. There were lots of how do you say, skeptical voices when the document was published, the policy was published. But it was interesting to see the recent changes, accelerated changes. For example, the appointment of women at the helm of big corporations like Samba Bank, the appointment of a woman at the head of the stock exchange, of a variety of very symbolic moves, but that we hope are much more than symbolic, are actually representing a trend of inclusion of women in the world of work in Saudi Arabia.
Talking about 2030 and vision for 2030, do you think really we can have an equal opportunity planet by 2030?
So whether we can achieve it by 2030 will depend on a lot of factors. But actually, it is the first time in history. After all, women have gained the right to vote even in the earliest countries, barely 100 years ago.
Yeah. We just celebrated 100 years here in the United States for women to get the vote. Yes.
And the progress has been extremely slow. And my sense is that for the last 50 years, this was seen as an issue of human rights. What is happening now is it remains a deep issue of human rights, women's rights, but it's also an economic issue. It's also an economic development issue. It's also a planet sustainability issue. If you do not use the competencies and the abilities of half of the people on the planet, you inevitably won't have the economic development that that societies require. And therefore, in fact, this is not just in a few countries. It's actually a trend. Most symbolically, womenomics have become the mantra of the policy of the Japanese government, who sees that future growth depends on the involvement of women in the world of work. This is also happening in many other countries, that the issue of women empowerment is not just a human rights issue, it's also a collective benefit issue, collective development issue.
But in the United States, where we are here now, women don't get equal pay for equal work.
Exactly, actually. And don't assume that because the United States is actually one of the wealthiest countries that it has necessarily the most progressive policies. We do not see necessarily an equivalency between development, GDP, and progress in policies. There are very different paces at which countries are resolving these issues. It is not the role of the United Nations to impose the pace to a country. So interestingly, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were established in 2015 based on a real consensus of states that within the challenging environment, we needed to have a consensus as to how we do development together and how do we create a sustainable planet. Within that context, the question of gender equality became very prominent It had been rather absent in the past, but for the same reason I explained earlier, that it is very much linked to the economy, then the issue of gender equality not only became one of the strategic goals of the United Nations and its member states, but also actually a condition of success of all the goals. So in practice, what that means is if the SDGs are successfully delivered, we will see the eradication of poverty, because the 1 billion people in the world who are the poorest are actually not 50-50 men and women. They are 70% women, 30% men. So we're going to affect the fate of many women around the world if we succeed in delivering the SDGs. And conversely, to deliver the SDGs, we need the power of women, we need women involved, we need women campaigning for new energies, we need women in the world of work, and therefore the empowerment of women is actually a condition to success.
I thank you, Joelle Tanguy, the Director of the Strategic Partnership Division within UN Women. We thank you for your time. We thank you for this interview.
Thank you,
so
Talal. That
much.
was a great pleasure.
Thank you.